Now, if you're still with us, I'm going to look at, in the second video, the USSR and Russia, and how it came to be where it is today. So this is the second video in this little series of 3, and in this I'm going to look at the protagonists, the opposite side to the United States, namely the USSR and Russia. And again, I'd like to go back and look at the history to see how the Russians have ended up where they are. And we'll look at the rulers of Russia, the tsars. And the first Tsar was Ivan IV, or better known as Ivan the Terrible. He ruled Russia from 1547 to 1584, and he was married to a Romanov. He was ruthless. He confiscated land and he gave it to his sort of favourite nobles, as it were, and he established serfdom. This was, in other words, the population were not allowed to have any land. They had to work the land of their noble. So peasants were allocated a strip of land which they farmed, and they had to give their noble masters a huge chunk of their harvest. They were only left with not quite enough to keep their families, and so they incurred debt. So they couldn't move freely until they'd got rid of the debt, and they were effectively slaves. By 1861, serfdom had been abolished, but it created a large underclass of landless people with no means of support. Tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands, died in the regular famines, and lots fled to countries in the West, leaving a shortage of labour for the developing industries. The Tsars ruled supreme. They saw it as a gift from God. There was no parliament, and the nobles were sort of sycophants, fearing incurring the wrath of the Tsar, which tended to be terminal. They accumulated vast wealth, which you can see in today, exemplified by the Kremlin and the palaces of St. Petersburg and the Russian crown jewels. In 1613, the line of succession was given to Mikhail Romanov, beginning a dynasty which lasted until 1917, over 300 years. 4 Tsars later, we come to the Tsar Peter the Great, and he declared himself Emperor of all Russia from 1682 until 1725. But he was a great moderniser, and he travelled extensively in Western Europe. He was learning skills like shipbuilding. In fact, he went and worked in a shipyard in England. And it led to the development of a large Russian navy. And he also, when he was visiting England, he was talking about learning about building cities, which of course became important when he built a new capital. As his only western seaport was Archangel in the Arctic, which was frozen up for half the year, he fought the Swedes, gaining access to the Baltic. And he also fought the Ottomans, the Turks, which gained him access to the Black Sea. And he expanded the Russian Empire, and it extended from northern California in America through Alaska all the way to the Baltic Sea in the west, and from the Arctic in the north to the Black Sea in the south. It was enormous. And in 1703 he founded the city of St. Petersburg on the Baltic coast. It was a low-lying swamp, and thousands of Russian serfs and captured Swedes were used to build it. Thousands died. In fact, it was known as the city of bones. People, lots of bodies buried underneath it. And in 1712 he moved the capital from Moscow up to St. Petersburg. And this is one of the palaces he built. It isn't the biggest. The biggest is the Winter Palace, which is actually in St. Petersburg. This is just outside. The Peterhof Palace. It's an amazing place. They had wealth beyond your wildest dreams. You know, today's oligarchs don't come anywhere near it. And but the peasantry living in abject poverty. The Russian peasantry grew more and more rebellious. He died in 1724, and 4 tsars later the throne passed to a tsar's wife, Catherine, of Catherine the Great fame, who ruled until 1796. I mean, she had a stonking big crown made for her coronation. I mean, what do you make of that? Goodness me. And it's part of the Imperial crown jewels, which are kept in the Kremlin. If you go to the Kremlin, you have to pay a little bit extra to go in and see them. Gobsmacking. I'm surprised that the regimes which came later, particularly the communists, kept them. Catherine the Great's husband, he was very pro-German, and he was booted out by his wife in a coup d'etat, and she imprisoned him, and he died in captivity. But she founded new cities in the south of Russia, places in the news at the moment: Kherson, Dnipro, Odessa, Sevastopol, and Mykolaiv. And she won the Crimea from the Turks. And she used her excessive promiscuity to good effect, giving many of her lovers powerful positions, keep under control. Her reign had mixed success, but the autocrats remained all powerful, and the peasantry remained restless. I mean, 3 hours later, having seen off Napoleon in 1812, we reached Alexander II in 1851. He was a reformer, abolishing serfdom. He reformed the judicial system and ended some of the privileges of the nobility, which upset them, of course. And he introduced military national service, call-up, and promoted universities. He confined the large Jewish population to one region of Russia. I mean, they experienced great hardship, and 2 million of them emigrated. I mean, most of them went to America, which has got a very large Jewish population. And there were several attempts on his life. Some of the new intelligentsia were unhappy with the slow pace of change and with the retention of autocratic rule. And in 1881, one of their number assassinated the Tsar in St. Petersburg with a bomb when he was travelling in his coach. And the Church of the Saviour on the Blood was built on the site. And that's it. And an amazing place. On the inside, it's even more amazing. His son, Alexander III, who'd witnessed his dad being killed by this bomb, he became the Tsar. And having witnessed this assassination, reforms were ditched and years of repression began. He reinforced his absolute rule. Persecution of the Jews was increased. Torture by the secret police of anyone remotely suspected of sedition was common. And in 1887, there was a plot to assassinate Alexander III, and it was uncovered, and the perpetrators were hanged. One was the brother of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, alias Lenin, and his hanging was to change the course of history big time. Alexander III was he was the one who commissioned Fabergé to make the fabulous jewelled eggs as Easter gifts for his wife. And he also started building the Trans-Siberian Railway, albeit using what was essentially slave labour. And this is one of the Fabergé eggs in gold and enamel, pearls and jewels. I can't remember how many were made. I mean, what, 30 odd. Some of which are still missing. But when Russia was suffering hard times in the early 20th century, some of them were sold. I think the Queen of the United Kingdom, I think she has a couple, but they're priceless. He died in 1894, aged just 49, and was succeeded by his son, the unfortunate Nicholas II, who was only 26, and he'd had no preparations to be the Tsar. But he just living a sort of grand life. He was committed to the continuation of autocratic rule, as decreed by God. But in 1904, a severe thrashing by Japan in the war over Korea and Manchuria, in which the Russian Navy was completely destroyed, followed by a Bloody Sunday in which peaceful workers attempted to present him with a petition, were gunned down. That sealed his fate. In 1905, there was a revolution, which was brutally suppressed. But although it led to the introduction of parliamentary rule, it was not enough. Matters were further complicated as the Tsar's only son, Alexei, had inherited haemophilia, which was sort of running rife in the male lines leading back to Queen Victoria. It's a blood disorder, preventing blood from clotting. And there was no cure. There still isn't. Although it can be prevented now. And as doctors were unable to do anything, the Tsar and the Tsarina, Alexandra, fell under the spell of an illiterate charlatan, Rasputin. And this is the young lad himself, Alexei Romanov. Little did he know what was to come. And this was this charlatan, Rasputin. The Tsarina in particular was in awe of the fella. Members of the royal circle felt that Rasputin's influence over the royal family threatened the stability of the empire, and in December 1916 they murdered him. But the Imperial family, the Tsar and Tsarina, they attended his funeral. In 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire was assassinated in Serbia. The Russians sided with Serbia and mobilised its military on the German-Austrian borders. And Germany declared war on Russia, which was it was hopelessly prepared for war. And the Russians were annihilated at the Battle of Tannenberg. The Tsar dismissed his commander-in-chief and he took on the role himself, visiting the front. The Germans slaughtered the Russian forces, and while Nicholas was away, there were uprisings throughout Russia. Looting of fruit shops was rife, culminating in the demoralised troops in St. Petersburg siding with the populace. And in 1917, Nicholas II abdicated. It was the end of the 300-year Romanov dynasty. And this is him, Nicholas II, with his wife Alexandra and the 3 princesses, and his unfortunate son Alexei. And this, I think, was taken after the abdication, and they don't look too happy. If they knew what was coming, they'd have been even more unhappy. A request was made that the Imperial family be offered asylum in England. I mean, King George V was Nicholas's cousin, but fearing a revolution, the British government refused. It seemed a sort of a petty thing to do. And this is a photograph of them in better times. Their fate was sealed, and they were taken to Ekaterinburg in the east, a long way east. And there was a movement in Russia which supported the Romanovs. It was called the White Army, and they set out to rescue them. But the Red Army knew about it, and they were shot and butchered in the cellar of Ipatiev house, and they were buried in a nearby forest. That was the end of them. Years later, their remains were discovered by a private individual, and they were identified from their DNA. The Duke of Edinburgh was involved because he was directly related to them in some way, and his DNA formed part of the investigation. However, they were identified as the Russian Tsarist family, and they were reinterred with their royal ancestors in St. Peter and St. Paul's Fortress in St. Petersburg. I think Vladimir Putin attended the ceremony. The Tsarist regime was replaced by the Russian Provisional Government, which was quickly overthrown by the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known as Lenin. And that's him there, addressing some rally with his worker's cap in his left hand, although he was in fact very well educated. And and lived in Britain for quite a long time. He was a revolutionary socialist, a communist, and his philosophy was based on the works of Karl Marx. According to his sort of Marxist perspective, humanity would eventually reach pure communism, becoming a stateless, classless, egalitarian society of workers who were free from exploitation and alienation, controlled their own destiny and abided by the rule, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. And he was also influenced by the execution of his brother in what happened next. The wealthy capitalist landowning bourgeoisie were proud of everything. The country was divided up into independent states called republics. And to keep them on side, Lenin allowed ethnic groups to form their own republics. And in 1922, they all came together to form the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, or Soviet Union. The original republics were Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, and the Transcaucasian Federation, which included Armenia, Azerbaijan and Georgia. Everything would be carried out through workers' councils called Soviets. It didn't go well, and there were some uprisings which were absolutely flattened, and there were terrible famines to contend with. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, died. And in 1919, to quell any dissent, concentration camps were introduced, many in the distant east, in a freezing cold region of Siberia. And they were called gulags. Any dissent was brutally suppressed by the secret police, the Cheka. Anyway, Lenin died in 1924, and he was succeeded by Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin. And this is him, Uncle Joe. He was born in Georgia, where they still think very highly of him. Although why, I don't really know. Stalin introduced a command economy based on 5-year plans. There were collective farms and much industrialisation. And other countries were incorporated into the USSR. But there were many, many famines and purges of so-called enemies of the people. Millions, I mean literally millions, died. It was brutal. From the 22nd of June 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the USSR. It was called Operation Barbarossa. I mean, Hitler had deceived Stalin, because just before about 1939 they'd signed a non-aggression pact. So the USSR was totally unprepared for this, and their forces were swept aside as the German tanks, infantry and aircraft swept across the flat lands. The USSR retreated east, destroying anything which may have been useful to the Germans. The Germans advanced on Moscow, but their supply lines were overstretched. The winter was severe. I mean, minus 45 degrees Celsius, unbelievably cold. And they just didn't have the They didn't have the gear to counter it. The clothes even. And the counter-attack in December, it pushed the Germans back. This is the infamous weapon called a Stalin organ, because they look like organ pipes in churches. It's a terrifying thing. Played a large part in the reversal of German fortunes. But Stalin, overconfidence by Stalin caused setbacks, and the decisive battle was for Stalingrad, no, Volgograd, between August 1942 and February 1943. It was the most vicious battle ever fought. Losses on both sides were huge, but the Soviet Union, the USSR, prevailed, and it was the beginning of the end for Germany. It was just a matter of time then. There was then a race for territory between a Western alliance in the west and the USSR in the east. And they met at Torgau on the River Elbe to the southwest of Berlin, which had already been taken by the USSR. So the capital of Germany, Berlin, was now in the middle of Soviet East Germany, which was a bit of a problem for the Allies, the French, the Americans and the British. Stalin had gained Poland, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia and East Germany, but at colossal cost. 27 million people of the USSR were killed, and 19 million, it's an unbelievable number, of whom were civilians, and the countries became republics of the USSR. Stalin wanted to use these states as a buffer against any future invasion from the West, which seems particularly relevant today. The Western nations and the USA formed an alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. An iron curtain came down between them, which extended from the Arctic all the way down to the Black Sea, and so began the Cold War. The Americans secreted the Nazi rocket scientists, the ones who had been producing the V-1 and V-2 missiles. They secreted them to the USA, developing missiles and nuclear bombs. But the USSR had a sort of a spy network which infiltrated these programs, and they developed their own hydrogen bombs and long-range missiles capable of delivering them. And in 1957, the USSR launched the first satellite, Sputnik 1. And there's a sort of exploded version of it. I can remember seeing it, coming back from Scouts one day, or one night. This silver thing moving slowly across the sky, giving out a beep beep noise. Although it was probably the sort of the remains of the rocket, which you could see, because this thing was a little satellite, was really, really small. Well, this caused consternation in the United States, as the USSR now had a rocket which could deliver nuclear bombs all the way to the United States. and it started a race leading to the first moon landing by the United States in 1969. And the arms race was now on in big time. But the USSR, it didn't have the manufacturing nor the financial might to keep up with the United States of America, let alone surpass them. The standard of living was dreadful. Everything was drab. The houses were drab. The shops were drab with next to nothing in them. There was little choice. I mean, the architecture is scathingly called Stalinist Baroque. Everything was grim, except the wonderful Moscow metro and vodka, and the anaesthetic of the masses, which was dirt cheap. Alcoholism became an epidemic, and still is to a large extent. Stalin died in 1953 and was succeeded by Nikita Khrushchev. He loosened the reins of Stalin, but the Cold War continued with the USA and the USSR vying for worldwide dominance, leading to many conflicts in many countries. And after Khrushchev was Leonid Brezhnev in 1964. He tightened the reins again. He achieved nuclear parity with the US on nuclear weapons. He was the one who invaded Afghanistan and supported North Vietnam in its war with the USA. However, the USSR was stagnating technically, economically and agriculturally. Military expenditure was consuming more and more of the budget, and it just wasn't sustainable. Brezhnev died in 1982. Eventually, in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the president. And that's the man himself. He wasn't the usual dour Russian. He was much more open and chatty. And his wife often accompanied him. When he got to the top job, the cupboard was bare. Corruption, ineptitude and lethargy were rife. And he adopted a policy of perestroika, or restructuring, and glasnost, which was openness. And the Soviets in the past, they'd had no say in the 5-year plans that Stalin dished up. And some saw a better way of doing it. And it began to deviate from the centralised 5-year plan. And Gorbachev was quite lenient about that. Censorship was loosened, but the standard of living remained poor. And he visited Britain, France and West Germany, and in 1989 he mooted a pan-European group in a speech in which he said, "We assign an overriding significance to the European course of our foreign policy. We are resolutely against the division of the continent into military blocs facing each other, against the accumulation of military arsenals in Europe, against everything that is the source of the threat of war. In the spirit of the new thinking, we introduced the idea of the all-European house, which signifies, above all, the acknowledgement of a certain integral whole, although the states in question belong to different social systems and are members of opposing military political blocs standing against each other. This term includes both current problems and real possibilities for the solution." In fact, it proposed a sort of new European alliance stretching from the Urals all the way west to Portugal. the Americans weren't having any of that, as this would seriously undermine their influence in Europe. And this is him in New York. Reagan was president. Bush Senior, I think, was the vice president. And Reagan and Gorbachev had a meeting in Reykjavik in Iceland, at which they signed a treaty to limit nuclear missiles. I mean, basically, Reagan had him over a barrel. He was talking about American developments of weapons in space, which, I mean, Gorbachev knew that the Russians had. There was no way they could keep up. And in the background, of course, is the World Trade Center, which I mentioned in an earlier video about America. I mean, given the situation in Ukraine today, which is the 22nd of March 2022, it's a great shame that Gorbachev's suggestion wasn't taken more seriously. Anyway, ultimately, Gorbachev's more sort of laissez-faire approach led to many of the Soviets wanting independence. And this caused consternation amongst the die-hard communists in the Politburo, and they attempted a coup, which failed. Transition from Soviet to independent countries went relatively smoothly, apart from in Romania, which had been pillaged by the Ceausescu family. They were Ceausescu and his wife were sort of captured and executed. By the late 1980s, pillage of the state assets had started. In 1991, Gorbachev dissolved the USSR, and Boris Yeltsin became the first president of the independent country, Russia. He introduced a capitalist market economy, and he did this using shock therapy, which is an American idea. It came out of Chicago, i.e., in other words, do it all at once and get the worst out of the way quickly. The Russian economy couldn't compete in a free market. Inflation was more than 2,000%. I mean, we're worrying today that it's going to get to 7%. The ruble was worthless. And what made matters worse was industry just couldn't compete with the free world economies. Mines and factories were closed. Unemployment almost unknown in the USSR. It just rocketed. Everything was owned by the state, from huge industrial complexes and to corner shops. And Yeltsin set about selling it all off. Every citizen was given vouchers, which he could exchange for shares in the privatised companies or privatised enterprises. But they couldn't get rid of them quickly enough for cash, and most of them were hoovered up by a few hands a few people who were in the know. Bigger enterprises were sold off by auction. There was intense competition, leading to intimidation, murder, gang warfare, bombs under cars, private armies, and fixed auctions where there was only one bidder. I mean, a classic example was the interest of a consortium from China, a company in China. They made an offer, but when they disembarked from their plane, one of their number was kidnapped before they got to the airport buildings. And the others were told that he would disappear if they didn't withdraw their offer. and I think they were on the next plane out. It was mayhem, and many assets worth billions were bought for next to nothing. You know, one of them I seem to remember was bought for about £100 million, and not long afterwards it was sold for 13 billion. The beneficiaries of this rip-off became known as oligarchs, and they quickly shifted their massive wealth abroad, especially to London, where they laundered their illicit gains in property. Hundreds of billions of dollars which were destined for the economic reform and improvement of the workers' lot were taken from the country. The oligarchs weren't shy about flaunting their fortunes, of buying sort of humongous yachts, planes, football clubs, mansions, businesses, etc. I mean, Russia had been robbed. Yeltsin also needed money to finance his election in 1996, and he did more shady deals to secure this. A little bit about Chechnya. This is a sort of Muslim republic in the south. The Chechen Soviet was denied its independence, and the Chechen rebels began a brutal campaign in Russia. I mean, Yeltsin tried and failed to prevent it in the first Chechen War, and then in 1998 there was a financial crisis again, mainly caused by the fall in oil prices. I mean, wages and pensions weren't paid, banks were closed, you couldn't get any money out, and in 1999 Yeltsin resigned and nominated a relatively unknown politician, Vladimir Putin, as his successor. And there he is with three of his mates. Who would have thought that that lad in his cap standing at the back would become one of the most powerful men in the world? And I think two of his friends, two of those lads there, I think they became oligarchs. And there he is at his inauguration, with Yeltsin standing behind him. This was in the year 2000. Putin was a lawyer. He trained as a lawyer. And he worked for the KGB, the secret police, in a variety of roles. But sort of desk-bound roles. He wasn't running around James Bond-like. But he left them in 1991 when the Berlin Wall fell, and began his political career arriving in Moscow in 1996, where he quickly rose through the ranks, becoming president of Russia in the year 2000. To do that, you must be ruthless and cunning. The economy improved dramatically, as did the Russian standard of living. He persuaded the oligarchs to toe the line or else, by making an example of a chap called Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He was the owner of Yukos, a big gas and oil company, which he'd achieved during Yeltsin's sell-off. Anyway, Putin jailed him for 10 years for fraud, money laundering and embezzlement. And Putin froze the shares, making them worthless, and he eventually nationalised the company so it was state-owned. Needless to say, his popularity soared. He dealt with the Muslim Chechens, who'd proclaimed Dagestan a separate country and had been terrorising Moscow. He reduced the Chechen capital Grozny to rubble in a brutal bombardment which lasted from December 1999 to February 2000. And this is Grozny in 2000, after he's finished with it. It was the shape of things to come, unfortunately. But not much publicity was given to it at the time. The conflict continued until 2009, with atrocities being committed by both sides, as happens in wars. Some 20 to 50,000 civilians were killed, but Grozny's been rebuilt in a very short space of time, and polls suggest that it's a very happy place to live, which I suspect it is, given what it's been through the last 20 years. He reverted back to the former Soviet national anthem tune, with new words appropriate for the new independent Russia. It's a tune we're very familiar with, it things like the Olympics. And this enhanced Putin's popularity even more. He's very popular with Russians, who see him as having restored their national pride. Since the days of Gorbachev, the Russians had felt that their noses had been rubbed in the dirt, that they'd been gloated at and humiliated. His treatment of dissidents at home and abroad, people like Litvinenko and the Skripals and Navalny, they show that he's not a person to be messed with, isn't Mr. Putin.